As many of you guys know, in fact, as most of those who have checked out my reviews and the kind of movies which I like on this channel before will know, I really love having the opportunity to shed light on movies which deserve to be talked about more and seen more and appreciated more in the horror genre as a whole, but much more specifically in the monster or creature feature sub-genre. Movies like Splinter, The Thing, Isolation, Clown, and more recently ones which you guys recommended to me like Screamers and Virus, which I've come to love in more recent times. This little discussion that we can have between you and I about these movies can provide some great recommendations. And I truly love finding good ones, because in this genre, if we're honest, there's a lot of trash. There really is. And I'm not the kind of person who just watches any horror movie because I'm a blind horror fan. Not at all. If it's trash, I'll say it's trash. And that's why finding these gems means so much. This is a gem. And I'm so happy to be able to say that, because I bought this movie after finding it through some kind of obscure Google search where I was looking up obscure horror films, as I am prone to do, but I didn't really expect it to be that great. I checked it out, I bought it on Amazon with a number of others, and I decided to check it out. Black Mountain, this 2014 Canadian horror which has some likening to The Thing. Well, that sounds pretty good. The Thing in Canada? That sounds promising. But then I watched it, and then I started making notes. And then I was expecting those notes to become negative at some point. Maybe that some practical effects or special effects weren't quite good enough. Maybe that the acting or the character choices started to let it down. Maybe that the ending ruined it. Something like A Yellow Brick Road, which is a brilliant movie until you get to the last 5 minutes. That didn't happen. In fact, the credits rolled, and then I watched it again, because this is a brilliant horror movie. And if you like the kind of movies that I review on this channel, and you have a similar taste to me, I think you're going to like this film a lot. In fact, I love it. This is immediately my top 10 favourite movies of all time. And that may seem very hasty to say, but there are some occasions where I don't even need the time to think it over. I know. Split was like that for me this year. Shyamalan's Split. Brilliant movie. I love it more and more as the year goes by. This is one of those films, because I watched it twice in one day, back to back, and I didn't find a single moment dull or boring, and I loved it even more the second time. I'm so happy to be able to say that. Now, what I will say about this movie, and this isn't a negative at all, it's just something that you need to know going into the film, is that this movie is sometimes spoken about, even on the front of the DVD box, for instance. The quote from one of the sources references The Thing, like The Thing crossed with fill in the blank. That's not the case. But at the same time it is. And what I mean by that is, don't go into this movie expecting The Thing, because it is not that kind of horror film. This is not a creature feature in the regular sense. This movie, if I could describe it as best as I can, is what you would get if you took a horror concept in the way of something like The Babadook, more than The Thing, and then put it in the location of The Thing. So more of a psychological horror with elements of physical danger in an isolated, snowy, cold location with a completely male cast, because that's what this movie has. Older guys, no women at all. Again, very reminiscent of The Thing, and there are actually a couple of homages in the movie, or at least I saw them as homages. I don't know if they were designed to be, but some of them are very, very close. For instance, one of the main characters, when you first see him, is playing an 8-bit computer game. Very reminiscent of when you first see MacReady playing chess on the computer. Then, immediately after you see that character, a helicopter lands. So again, very reminiscent of The Thing, these moments. At the same time then, though, there was a dream catcher hanging on the wall in one of the cabins. I don't know if that was just happenstance or if it's a reference to Stephen King's Dreamcatcher, because again, this movie has some very similar feels and visuals to the cabin section of the movie Dreamcatcher, which I know a lot of people don't like, but I really like the scenes in the cabin. There was some great bloody horror in those scenes, and this movie has some of that as well. So I don't know if that was an homage, but it was there, and I took it as meaning that. Now, as I said, there is a physical level of threat in the movie, but in a very similar way to the Babadook, it's much more about the audio experience and about the visual experience from a mental point of view, in as much as it's more about the effect on the characters rather than seeing a monster pop up. Because with The Thing, you've kind of got both. It's about the monster and the characters, whereas in the Babadook, it's not really about the Babadook, it's about the mother and son, and then the Babadook just supports that and adds to the horror. This movie is more the latter. The creature or monster or villain or whatever you want to look at it as, it's really not fully explained, it's very ambiguous, which I really like, is much more Babadook than Thing. I cannot stress that enough. So when you go into this movie, if you expect that, then I think you'll enjoy the ride. Now, as far as things which really stuck out to me, that I really thoroughly enjoyed, one is that, as far as I could tell on 2 watchings, there's no music in this movie. Not even in the subtitles, or not the subtitles, the credits at the end. No music, no soundtrack at all. I love that. I think that is brilliant. And I've mentioned on the channel before that I really love it when a movie doesn't have music in key scenes, or just has silence, where usually there would be a jump scare. Again, another point. This movie has no jump scares. Literally 0 jump scares. How awesome is that? Then, you've got the characters. The characters are so much better than I was expecting them to be. Now, I will put a caveat on that. There were 1 or 2 moments where some of the dialogue felt like it was very memorized from a script rather than spoken extemporaneously. And that's not an awful thing, it's not a deal breaker by any means, and I think most people won't notice it. And I think, to be honest, from a nitpicking point of view, the reason why I do notice that more is because I don't use a script. This video, for instance, I'm not looking at anything, I'm just staring at the wall. I don't script any of my videos, so I can often tell very quickly when somebody has memorized what they're trying to say. And there were 1 or 2 scenes where one character will talk for a long time, and it sounds like a monologue. But it's not bad, it doesn't take you out of the moment, it's such a small thing that most people probably won't even notice. And if that's the best thing I've got to say against the film, it shows how good it really is. Now, another thing that I really liked, because there are plenty of things which I did like, is the sound design. I already touched on the fact that there's no music, but as well there are certain sound choices made which were very reminiscent of the Babadook. I don't know if it was inspired by the Babadook, it came out at a similar kind of time. In fact, I think this came out before it, so that seems doubtful, but very reminiscent. And this particular sound, not a sound effect, but a choice is made, and you'll understand what I mean when you see the movie, that when it first happened, I wasn't sure if I was going to like it. I thought, really? Is this where we're going to go with this? I'm not sure if I like this, guys. Don't ruin this for me. But then it really grew on me. And the second time I watched the movie, I was anticipating that choice. And I loved it. This movie has such a fantastic feeling of dread. I found this to be, especially on the first watching, a very intimidating movie. And I don't feel that very much in films. And to be honest, it's not because of a monster. And it's not even because of the characters. The way this movie is shot is superb. The camera work has such a level of quality to it. Everything is so crisp, the sound quality is fantastic, the cinematography is much more creative than it easily could have been. There are some really nice long shots with one take. One of the opening shots of the film is just a camera rotating around people playing cards. Very Tarantino-esque, and I love stuff like that. It was above and beyond what it easily could have been, and what many people would have said it should have been. Many people don't expect much of horror films, but when they go above and beyond, it makes such a difference for those of us who do love them, and this movie does just that. It goes above and beyond in every way, be it characters, story, even the effects, because there are some practical effects in there. I don't think there may have been some CGI, I can't recall, probably was, but the effects are all brilliant. When it comes to the design of the effects, the execution, it's brilliant. A lot of the gore was very realistic, and because of the fact that, again, there was little, if any, music, more sound effect cues rather than music cues, it made it that much more effective. In a very Green Room kind of way, for those of you guys who have seen that movie, the violence and the gore in that movie has a very real feel to it, which makes it much more savage. A savagery which I would describe as very British in its horror, because British violence in movies, it doesn't pull back, it doesn't allow you to have an escape. It shows it, and it's quite brutal, in a similar way to French and Korean horror. I love that this movie has that as well. This movie feels like everything I wanted it to be, even though some of it I didn't know I wanted it to be. As I think I touched on earlier, I mentioned the fact that it's fairly ambiguous, and I don't mean the ending, I mean the whole movie. That's kind of a spoiler, I guess, in a general way, but I love the fact that it's ambiguous. And it's not really a spoiler, because look at The Thing. The end of The Thing is ambiguous, but in the best possible way. That's the best way that that movie could have ended. This movie, in a similar way, makes bold choices about things not to tell you, or things that aren't explained, or things which are inferred rather than told to you, or even shown to you in some cases. And in fact, although I compared it very much to a combination of the Babadook in the location of The Thing, which is what it is, in a general sense of course, I would also say that it's very much like the Sphere in the location of The Thing. So I don't know how many of you guys will have seen Sphere, and of those who have seen it, how many will like it. Personally, I love that movie. I think it has some brilliant horror concepts, and although the movie doesn't really go straight up horror, there's a lot of horrific stuff in that movie if you really think about it. Kind of like the Andromeda Strain. The Andromeda Strain doesn't have jump scares, but it's a pretty scary movie because of the concepts that are involved. Sphere is similar to that. This movie has some similarities to that again. Overall, as you can tell, I love this movie. So I could talk about it all day, but as always, we need to get to the scores. And spoiler alert, I'm going to score this pretty high, as you could probably guess. So first of all, we have the story and the plot. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there are some movies which I consider to be perfect. However, that is a very subjective view, and I have to be objective about it, and the simple fact is, I cannot give certain movies a 10, even though I think they're perfect. Like The Thing, for instance. I think The Thing is perfect in every way, but I can't just give it a 10 for everything because that's not accurate, and it wouldn't be fair to movies with more complex stories or that kind of thing. Something like Oldboy or Inception or The Matrix even, that do these really in-depth concepts. So for this movie, I'm going to give it a 7, because I'd personally love to give it a 10. In fact, I'm going to say that. Give it a 10 for everything, as far as my personal view, but putting myself to one side, I'm going to give it a 7, because it definitely went above and beyond. At the same time, though, the depth of the story doesn't go as far as some other movies which I've reviewed, and as always, it wouldn't be fair to those to score it on par with them. Plus, the ambiguity in many ways, not just the ending, is something which might put some people off. For me, I loved it, but I know some people don't like ambiguous stories, so that could hurt it for some people. As far as the characters go, it's a 9, and to be honest, that's subjective and objective. I'm giving it a 9 either way, because although I'd love to give it a 10, the only reason that I'm holding it back in that regard is because of what I mentioned earlier, the fact that some of the dialogue feels a little bit like it was maybe rehearsed a little bit too much, almost like listening to someone read from a book rather than speak in a conversation. You can tell the difference, you can hear the difference, that it's a little bit more wooden, like they're saying someone else's thoughts rather than their own, and you can tell that, or at least I could. So even though that's a small thing, I have to reflect that in the score. So it's still a 9 as far as I'm concerned. The characters apart from that though are truly superb. Very realistic, they don't get along, again very reminiscent of The Thing. I love them, the characters were superb. As far as the visuals, I'm going to give it an 8, and the reason why I'm giving it an 8 is because the cinematography is fantastic, the quality of the camera work is fantastic, the effects, as I mentioned earlier, are fantastic. I think overall it's a kind of movie where I could have done with maybe 1 or 2 more scenes of gore, because there is some gore in there, but even then, I think overall that's just my personal preference. I don't think the movie really needed more gore. I was just enjoying it so much that I wanted more. So again, that's very subjective, and I'm going to give it an 8 overall because I do think it definitely deserves that. I do feel like giving it a 9, but I don't know. I think I'm going to give it an 8 because, again, it wouldn't be fair to movies which really have crazy visuals and really well executed ones like Babadook, Thing, various others. So I'm going to give it an 8. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, well, there isn't one, so I'm giving it a full 10. And that's not an automatic thing. I don't just give it a 10 because it doesn't have any music, but there's a time and a place for not having music. And in the case of this movie, it justified that decision totally. Not just for the effect of being far creepier rather than just jump scares, which I love that choice, but also because it gave the movie a more realistic feel. It felt sometimes that the lack of music made you, or for me at least, made me feel like I was actually there in the moment, standing in the cabin with them, rather than watching a movie. And that was in part due to the lack of music. It makes it feel more authentic and more real. I loved it for that. And finally, for the rewatchability and entertainment, well, it's fairly obvious. Of course it's a 10, both objectively and subjectively, because I watched it, I loved it, I watched it immediately, literally back to back. It's fantastic. For a group, not necessarily. It's not the kind of movie which I'd recommend for a big group of people to watch, because for that kind of scenario, unless you're all specifically there to be quiet and watch it, which isn't going to happen for most people, then it's just not that kind of movie. You need to watch it, you need to pay attention, and you need to savour how brilliant the movie is. In a group setting, watch Eli Roth's Clown, or something like that instead. That's far better for a group rewatching. Overall, though, that means that as a tabulation of all of the scores put together, I am giving Black Mountain a score of 4.4, which is really nice. That is a seriously high score for a horror movie, one of the highest scores I've given on this channel, which is mostly horror movies anyway, and as you can tell, I could talk about this movie even longer than I have been. I would love to get into spoilers. I might do a spoiler review, but we'll see. For now, if you like the movies that I review, then most definitely check this movie out as soon as you can. And I would love to hear down in the comments, if you do check it out or if you have already, how your thoughts compare. Did you enjoy the movie as much as I did, especially if you're a fan of the kind of movies which I review on the channel? But overall, that's it for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.